Have you ever wondered why someone who once seemed so close can disappear from your life with shocking cruelty, no explanation, no warmth, just distance so cold it feels like the entire relationship was a lie? One moment you mattered, the next moment you're treated like you never existed, and the question keeps looping in your mind. If they cared, how could they leave like that? That question is heavier than the breakup itself. It eats at your confidence. It rewrites your memories. It makes you doubt your worth. Because brutal endings create a brutal belief that you were never important. But what if that belief is wrong? What if the intensity of that cold discard is actually revealing something very different about the person who left? Something uncomfortable, something psychological, something most people completely misunderstand. Because human behavior is rarely as simple as it looks on the surface, especially when fear is involved. For many people, closeness feels natural. It feels safe. The more love grows, the more secure they become. But for others, closeness triggers the opposite reaction. It activates an alarm system deep inside the brain, an alarm that whispers one message over and over again: get out before this becomes dangerous. Not dangerous in a physical sense, dangerous emotionally, dangerous psychologically, dangerous to the fragile sense of independence they've built their entire identity around. These are people with what psychologists call an avoidant attachment style. And when emotional intimacy reaches a certain depth, something powerful begins to happen inside them. Their nervous system shifts. What once felt exciting starts to feel suffocating. What once felt comforting begins to feel overwhelming. Your presence, your affection, your emotional closeness slowly transforms into pressure they don't know how to handle. But here's the crucial detail most people never realize. Avoidant individuals rarely understand this reaction themselves. They don't sit down and logically decide to sabotage something meaningful. Instead, their brain begins protecting them automatically, quietly, subtly. At first, the signs are small. They take longer to respond. They seem distracted, less present, less emotionally available. You feel it before you fully understand it. A shift in energy, a strange distance forming where warmth once lived. And naturally, you try to close that distance. You talk more, you ask questions, you try to reconnect, but every step closer unintentionally activates the same internal alarm inside them. Their brain interprets closeness as a threat to autonomy, a threat to control, a threat to emotional safety. So the mind begins searching for an escape route. Not because the connection meant nothing, but because the connection started to mean too much. And that is where the situation becomes confusing, painful, and deeply misunderstood. Because when someone with avoidant patterns feels overwhelmed by intimacy, they rarely choose a gentle exit. They choose something much more extreme: a sudden shutdown, emotional detachment, sometimes even cruelty. To the person receiving it, it feels heartless, like a switch flipped overnight, like love evaporated without warning. But inside the avoidant mind, the experience feels completely different. Distance equals relief. Coldness equals protection. And the harsher the emotional cutoff becomes, the easier it is for them to maintain that distance. Because softness would reopen the connection, kindness would invite conversation, empathy would pull them back into emotional closeness they feel unequipped to handle. So the mind chooses the fastest solution. It burns the bridge. Not slowly, not thoughtfully, but brutally. And that brutality often leaves the other person carrying the heaviest burden of all, the belief that they were simply not worth staying for. But human psychology is rarely that simple. In fact, the deeper the emotional bond once was, the more dramatic the escape can become. Because escaping something meaningless requires very little effort. Escaping something powerful requires force, and that force is often mistaken for indifference, when in reality, it may be something far more complicated, something rooted in fear rather than absence of feeling, a defense mechanism built long before you ever entered their life, a strategy their mind learned to survive emotional vulnerability. Which means the brutal ending you experienced may not actually be the proof of what you think it is. It may be evidence of something much deeper happening beneath the surface. Because when fear hides beneath the surface of a relationship, it doesn't announce itself politely. It reshapes reality. The mind begins to protect itself in ways that feel irrational to anyone standing outside the experience. What once felt warm suddenly feels dangerous. What once felt exciting begins to feel heavy. And when that shift happens inside someone who fears emotional dependence, their brain begins a quiet but powerful process. It starts rewriting the story. Memories change tone. Small flaws grow larger. Minor disagreements become proof that the relationship was wrong all along. This isn't conscious manipulation, it's psychological self-defense. The brain is trying to create distance fast enough to stop the emotional pressure building inside. Because if the mind admits how meaningful the bond became, leaving would hurt, and avoidant patterns are built around one core mission: avoid pain by avoiding vulnerability. So the mind begins to downgrade the relationship. Suddenly they convince themselves you were too demanding, too emotional, too intense, too much. The strange part is that many of the qualities they now criticize were the very things that once drew them in. Your openness, your affection, your willingness to connect. But the deeper those qualities pulled them into intimacy, the louder the internal alarm became, and the brain found only one way to silence it: distance, coldness, detachment so sharp it shocks the person who once stood closest to them. From your perspective, the change feels unreal. You search for the moment things went wrong. You replay conversations, messages, memories, trying to find the mistake that caused the collapse. But the collapse didn't begin with something you said. It began with something they felt: a rising sense of emotional exposure they never learned how to navigate. For someone who fears dependency, closeness creates a terrifying question inside their mind. What happens if I lose myself in this? That fear isn't logical. It often comes from experiences long before you arrived. Early relationships that taught them emotional safety could disappear. Moments where vulnerability led to rejection, pressure, or disappointment. So their mind built a rule: never depend too much, never need too deeply, never allow someone to hold that much emotional power. At first, this rule stays hidden. The connection grows, attraction builds, everything feels natural. But once the bond deepens enough to challenge that rule, the avoidant nervous system reacts, and reaction doesn't look like confusion. It looks like certainty. Suddenly, they appear convinced the relationship is wrong. Their tone becomes firm. Their distance becomes absolute. This certainty is not clarity. It's emotional self-preservation. The brain is simplifying a complicated emotional conflict into one clean decision: leave. Because staying would require confronting feelings they've spent years learning to suppress. It would require leaning into vulnerability instead of escaping it. And for someone wired to avoid emotional dependency, that feels like stepping into unknown territory without armor. So they choose the familiar strategy: shut down, cut off contact. Create enough emotional damage that returning becomes difficult. From the outside, it looks cruel. From the inside, it feels necessary. But here's where the story becomes even more complicated. Because distance solves only the immediate pressure, it doesn't erase the emotional imprint that connection left behind. Feelings pushed away do not vanish. They simply wait in silence. Time begins to pass. The intensity of the breakup fades. The environment becomes calmer. The emotional threat that once felt overwhelming is no longer present, and something subtle starts to happen. Without the pressure of constant closeness, their nervous system slowly relaxes. The mind begins to wander back toward memories it once rejected. Moments of laughter, quiet conversations, the comfort that once existed before fear took control. At first, these memories appear briefly, then they return more often. Because once distance feels safe, curiosity begins to replace avoidance, and curiosity is powerful. It pulls attention back toward the very connection the mind tried so hard to escape. But by this point, the person on the other side of the story is usually fighting a different battle, trying to understand why something meaningful ended in such a brutal way, trying to rebuild confidence after being treated like someone who never mattered. And this is the moment where the path forward becomes critical because what you do next determines whether you stay trapped in the confusion they left behind or rise above it with clarity and strength. And this is where most people unknowingly walk into the deepest trap. The silence hurts. The cold ending replays in your mind. Every unanswered question creates a restless urge to fix what feels broken. So you reach out, you send the message, you try to explain, you try to remind them of what you shared, what you built, what it meant. Your intention is simple. You want clarity, you want understanding, you want the connection back. But to someone whose nervous system is wired to fear emotional pressure, every attempt to reopen the door feels like a tightening grip around their freedom. What feels like love from your side can feel like suffocation from theirs. The more you push for answers, the louder their internal alarm becomes. Their mind returns to the same survival strategy it used before. Distance, more distance, sometimes even harsher distance than before. They become colder, shorter, more detached. Not because they hate you, but because their brain is trying to protect the space it fought so hard to create. This is the painful paradox. The more you try to repair the connection, the more their instincts push them away. And slowly, a dangerous pattern begins to form. You chase, they retreat. You ask, they shut down. You try to prove your value. They become even more convinced they need space. This cycle can drain a person completely. It makes you question your worth. It makes you believe you must somehow convince someone to see what you already offered freely. But love was never meant to be proven through exhaustion. It was meant to be met halfway, and the moment you begin fighting for attention that should have been given willingly, something inside you starts to shrink. Your confidence fades, your dignity bends, your world becomes centered around someone who already chose distance. That is the moment where everything must change, because the power you think you lost was never in their hands. It was always in your response. The moment you stop chasing, the emotional landscape shifts in a way most people never expect. Silence replaces pursuit. Calm replaces desperation. Instead of trying to force the door open, you step back from it completely. At first, this feels unnatural. Every instinct tells you to fix things, to clarify, to reach out one more time. But restraint carries a strength that pursuit never will. When the pressure disappears, the avoidant mind loses the threat it was reacting to. There are no messages demanding explanations, no emotional weight pulling them back into a situation their nervous system once labeled overwhelming. The environment becomes quiet, and quiet has a strange effect on human psychology. It creates space for reflection. Without pressure pushing them away, their mind no longer needs to justify the escape so aggressively. The mental story that once painted the relationship as a problem begins to loosen because distance allows truth to return slowly. Memories start to surface again, not filtered through fear, but through perspective. The laughter they dismissed, the connection they minimized, the comfort they tried to convince themselves wasn't real. Suddenly, the relationship no longer feels like a threat. It feels like something they once had and now no longer do. This shift doesn't happen instantly. Human emotions rarely move that quickly. But curiosity begins to grow in the quiet. Curiosity about your life. Curiosity about your absence. Curiosity about whether the person they walked away from has truly moved forward. And here lies the deeper truth most people overlook. When you stop chasing someone who expected pursuit, your absence becomes louder than your presence ever was because pursuit confirms their narrative that you need them. But silence challenges that narrative. Silence suggests strength. It suggests independence. It suggests that the person they believed would remain emotionally available no matter what has chosen to stand on their own. And that realization creates a psychological tension inside the avoidant mind. Not the suffocating pressure of closeness, but the quiet pull of curiosity mixed with uncertainty. Yet the real transformation is not about whether they return. The real transformation is what happens inside you when you stop begging for recognition from someone who could not meet you with the same depth you offered. Because the moment you reclaim your emotional center, something powerful begins to grow. Clarity, strength, self-respect that no rejection can erase. And from that place, your life begins to expand again in ways the relationship once limited. And that expansion is the part most people never expect. Because when the noise of rejection finally fades, something clearer begins to rise inside you. Not anger, not bitterness, something stronger, perspective. You begin to see the relationship without the emotional fog that once surrounded it. The moments that felt confusing start making sense. The distance you kept trying to close suddenly reveals a pattern that was there all along. You weren't imagining the push and pull. You weren't overreacting to the sudden coldness. You were standing inside a dynamic that was never designed to feel stable. The truth is difficult, but it is freeing. You were offering connection to someone who feared connection. You were offering depth to someone trained to survive by staying shallow. You were offering consistency to someone whose instinct was escape. And when those two emotional worlds collide, the ending often looks exactly like the one you experienced. Sudden, harsh, unfinished. But unfinished stories have a strange power over the mind. They keep you stuck in the question of what could have been. They tempt you to believe that if you had just said one thing differently, acted one way better, loved a little smarter, the outcome would have changed. That belief is heavy. It chains your future to a past that can no longer grow. Because real relationships do not collapse from a single imperfect moment. They collapse when two emotional systems cannot meet in the middle. And you cannot build stability with someone whose instinct is to run from stability itself. This realization is not meant to harden your heart. It is meant to sharpen your awareness, because the same openness that allowed you to love deeply is not a weakness. It is one of the rarest human strengths, the ability to care fully, the courage to be emotionally present, the willingness to invest your time and attention into another person's world. These qualities are not flaws that drove someone away. They are signals of emotional maturity. The mistake was never loving deeply. The mistake was believing that someone who feared depth could hold that love without eventually retreating. Once you understand this, the meaning of the brutal discard begins to change. It stops being proof that you were unworthy. It becomes proof that the connection reached a level of emotional intensity the other person was not equipped to sustain, and that truth flips the entire narrative you once carried. The harsh ending was not the final verdict on your value. It was the limit of their emotional capacity. There is an enormous difference between those two realities. One diminishes you, the other simply reveals the boundaries of another human being. When you see that difference clearly, the grip of the past begins to loosen. You stop replaying the final conversation in your mind. You stop wondering if they ever cared. You stop measuring your worth through the lens of someone who could not stay. And slowly, something powerful returns. Your direction. You begin investing your attention back into the parts of life that were waiting quietly while you were fighting to understand someone else's silence, your goals, your growth, your peace. Energy that once flowed towards someone who pulled away now flows toward building a future that does not depend on their return. And here is the quiet irony hidden inside that shift. The moment you stop trying to reclaim what left, you begin attracting what actually belongs in your life. People who do not fear closeness, people who do not interpret vulnerability as pressure, people who meet presence with presence, not distance. But the deeper victory is not the relationships that may come later. The deeper victory is the relationship you rebuild with yourself. The moment you decide that your emotional energy will no longer be spent convincing someone to stay. The moment you understand that love should never require you to shrink, chase, or abandon your dignity. That realization is where real freedom begins. Not the freedom of forgetting the past, but the freedom of no longer being controlled by it. And once that freedom settles into your life, something extraordinary happens. The brutal ending that once broke your confidence becomes the moment that rebuilt your strength. Because sometimes the most painful rejection carries the clearest message. Not that you were too much, but that you were offering something powerful to someone who was never ready to receive it. And once you truly see that message, something inside you refuses to go back to the old way of thinking. You stop romanticizing the pain. You stop telling yourself the story that the relationship ended because you were not enough. That story loses its grip the moment you recognize a deeper truth. Some people do not leave because you lacked value. They leave because your presence forced them to confront emotions they spent a lifetime avoiding. Your honesty forced them to look inward. Your depth forced them to feel more than they were prepared to feel. Your consistency challenged the walls they built long before you arrived, and walls that strong rarely collapse peacefully. They crack under pressure. They shake. Then the person behind them runs. That escape can look brutal. It can look cold. It can look like someone who never cared at all. But real indifference is quiet and effortless. Brutality takes energy. Detachment that extreme takes effort. It is the mind slamming doors as fast as possible because it fears what might happen if one of them stays open. Understanding this does not mean excusing the pain you experienced. It does not mean accepting treatment that disrespected your heart. It means seeing clearly. And clarity is the most powerful weapon you can carry into the rest of your life. Because once you understand what happened, you stop chasing the illusion that closure must come from the person who left. Closure is not something they deliver. Closure is something you claim. You claim it the moment you decide that your story will not revolve around someone else's emotional limitations. You claim it the moment you refuse to measure your worth by the actions of someone who was running from themselves. And in that moment, your attention shifts away from the past and towards something much more important: your future. A future where your emotional strength becomes a filter instead of a burden. You begin recognizing the early signs you once ignored. The hesitation when conversations became too real. The subtle distance when closeness deepened. The moments where vulnerability was met with discomfort instead of openness. These signals used to confuse you. Now they guide you. Because growth is not about becoming colder. It is about becoming wiser with where you place your warmth. The world does not need less love. It needs love offered with awareness. You begin choosing people who lean toward connection instead of running from it. People who understand that intimacy is not a trap but a shared responsibility. People who do not treat emotional depth like a threat to their freedom. And when you meet those people, something remarkable happens. Relationships stop feeling like battles for attention. They begin to feel like partnerships. Effort flows in both directions. Communication becomes easier. Silence no longer carries hidden tension. And the energy you once spent trying to convince someone to stay is now invested in building something that actually grows. That shift changes everything. Because the truth most people learn too late is this: love should expand your life, not shrink it. It should bring clarity, not constant confusion. It should challenge you to grow, but never force you to fight alone for its survival. When you understand that, the brutal discard that once shattered your confidence transforms into something else entirely. It becomes a turning point, a moment that forced you to confront what you truly deserve. Not temporary attention, not affection that disappears the moment vulnerability appears, but connection with someone who sees emotional depth as strength instead of danger. That kind of connection exists, but you only recognize it once you stop chasing the people who run from it. And the moment you fully accept that truth, something powerful settles inside you. Peace. Not the fragile peace that depends on someone returning. Real peace. The kind that comes from knowing your value never changed just because someone else could not hold it. The kind that allows you to walk forward without resentment, without desperation, without needing the past to make sense. In order for your future to begin, because sometimes the harshest ending carries the clearest lesson. You were never too much. You were simply offering depth in a world where some people only know how to survive on the surface. And once you understand that, you stop shrinking your heart to make others comfortable. You start living boldly enough to find the ones who are ready to meet you there. And once you begin living with that kind of clarity, the past loses its power to define you. You stop waiting for the apology that may never come. You stop imagining the conversation that would finally explain everything. You stop holding space in your life for someone who chose distance over courage. Instead, you start asking a different question. Not why they left, but why you ever believed their leaving could determine your worth. That question changes the direction of your life. Because the truth is simple. Even if it took pain to see it, someone else's inability to stay present does not erase the depth you offered. Their fear does not reduce your value. Their escape does not make your love a mistake. In fact, the opposite is true. The willingness to love deeply in a world where many people hide from intimacy is a rare kind of strength. It means you were brave enough to show up fully even when the outcome was uncertain. Most people never risk that. Most people stay guarded, distant, half present. They protect themselves by never allowing anything real to form. They call it independence. But often it is simply fear wearing a confident mask. You chose something different. You chose connection. And yes, sometimes that path leads through heartbreak. Sometimes it places your trust in someone who was never ready to hold it. But heartbreak is not proof that love failed. It is proof that you had the courage to offer something genuine. Now, the real question is what you do with that courage next. You can bury it beneath disappointment and become more guarded with every experience. You can convince yourself that caring deeply is dangerous, that vulnerability always ends in pain. Or you can transform the lesson into something stronger, wisdom.